Okay, great. Then we'll go ahead and get started. As I said, we'll keep it pretty informal. We have Kevin from Engineers Without Borders here to talk about the small grant under SPSP that closed out a few months ago now, and they were working in Kosovo. So we'll just have him start out by giving a really quick program overview and then go into some questions and answers and take it from there.
Sure. Thank you, Laura. First, I'm going to frame Engineers Without Borders a little bit for those of you who aren't familiar with the organization. The organization pretty much has three different tiers. We have our chapter model, which most people know us from in our history of being around since 2002, and that includes student chapters and professional chapters. And that's the bulk of our membership. That's about 17,000 members now for that. And that includes anything, like I said, from students who put programs together in their undergrad and master's degrees to professionals who volunteer during their evenings and then perhaps go on trips for extended periods of time. And those two initiatives focus on a community-based approach where they go in and they work with the community for somewhere between 5 and 6 years. And that's sort of spun off this organization within EWB called the Engineering Service Corps, which is the piece I manage. And that sort of takes it a next step. And that really takes those folks who have been on programs and perhaps have worked in international development in their career. And we then use them as sort of our stepping stone of these senior members. And they work with different foundations and local NGOs, and then specifically, like I'll talk about here in a few minutes, with our Farmer to Farmer program in Kosovo. So those are the young women and men and older folks in their careers that have shown us and proved that they're not just engineers, but they also understand the cultural context of working on projects and the sensitivity of going in and taking a technical skill and implementing it into a culture that perhaps is unfamiliar with the type of work that they have been doing in their domestic career. And so I always use this story is when I interview potential recruits for my projects, it's like interviewing someone for a CEO. I had an engineer tell me the other day that they had never been through an interview process like I put them through. And a lot of that is not just to see what they can do in terms of the technical side of it, it's really to get that cultural understanding of, that cross-cultural context of putting them into a position that may be typically not what they've done in their career. So, I really pride ourselves as an organization that we filter that type of process as well when we look for our recruits. So then coming specifically to our program here that we had in Kosovo, we started in June 2016, and it was a year-long small grant mechanism through VEGA, and that was a technical program. We worked with a USAID program in Kosovo called Agriculture Growth and Rural Opportunities, and that's still being implemented by Tetra Tech. And I think that partnership alone was one of the key strengths of our relationship. We basically had a seat in their office. We worked hand in hand with their value chain managers. We used their coordinators. We used their drivers. So, other than the fact that we were, from the U.S. overseas there for a period of time, you would have never known that we weren't part of their office. And I think, looking at Mark Wood, who was the country director there, his initiative to work with EWB and his pull of us into that system and just assimilation into the society of working with his staff really made it, us comfortable, especially going into a culture in an area that we weren't familiar with working in. And I'll talk more about how we partnered with them throughout the process, and hopefully you guys have some questions on how we made that work and how we had some challenges. There were definitely some challenges, and then I think with any program, you experience challenges. So just in general, from our year-long grant in Kosovo, we partnered with 26 strategic partners. So through the agro program, they work with agribusinesses. This is medium-sized agro processors, dairies, herb dryers, folks who are at that smaller tier of commercial state that are trying to bump it up to the next stage. And, what that really did was it filtered through that when they expanded their business, they were able to work with smallholder farmers, more of them. One of the examples I use is with table grapes. Kosovo is an amazing agriculture region for growing table grapes. But because of the lack of supply chain and post-harvest, all the grapes are sold on the local market. Through the initiative that we worked on there, we worked with one of their strategic partners on, I think, 4 different projects while we were there. And they were going to become the first commercialized table grape processor in Kosovo. And this included everything from transportation studies on how to get the grapes from the farm to their aggregation center, to figuring out how to cool these things. It's amazing. I never knew this about grapes, but when you can control the post-harvest storage of a grape, and perhaps maybe you went to Whole Foods a couple days ago or one of your supermarkets and got a grape, some of those grapes have been in storage for up to 6 months. I never realized that, but it's the optimal temperature to do that is critical. Like even when it comes down to the humidity part of it, like you have to control that from the time it's picked to the time it's put into the supermarket. So we worked on some pre-cooling designs with one of our mechanical engineers to, like I said, that transportation study to help them figure out a routing system to go pick up their grapes to bring them there. In that year-long program, we also scoped a lot of projects that didn't make sense. So we and this will come back to what the conversation is today about how we designed our program management style. But we scoped 65 projects. In a year-long program, that's a lot to try to fit in while you're trying to actually implement projects as well. So, I think we worked 6 days a week from the beginning, and we were in the field from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. sometimes driving across that country. And the nice thing about Kosovo is it's sort of small. But in terms of the success rate, I think that's an okay success rate, just above 50%, because we did complete about 36 scopes of work. But it was a lot of effort in terms of trying to get the project up and running. One of my feedback in general to how I think this program could have been structured a little differently is that perhaps we would have sent a program manager in a month ahead of time without any engineers to just go do that scoping. But I think that was part of the fact that, we didn't really know exactly what we were getting into with agro. They had a list of projects for us that they wanted us to look at, but they hadn't vetted them any further than, a phone call or anything. So, those field visits, those site visits, especially for engineers, they have to get their eyes on something before we can decide if it's a project that makes sense or not. So that was a piece of the beginning and two in terms of why we did have a little bit of a slow start, I think. But overall for the program, we sent 22 volunteers there in the year-long program, one staff member, and then we had a local coordinator that we hired through the grant program. In total, over that year-long project, we had 873 volunteer days in country. And this is just another summary of some of the targets and actuals that we did under the program. Again, 22 volunteers, the 873 days, some of these other ones that I just mentioned. But the big one to me that we exceeded and I'm really proud of is these volunteer days from the U.S. And that just includes remote support from additional engineers to perhaps some of the engineers that came back to country and continued to support our program either through a different scope of work or continuing on with some of their current ones. And, I guess I should have said this from the beginning. I'm not an engineer. I wish I was smart enough to be an engineer, but to see their dedication, and especially ones who belong to EWB, of following through on projects is pretty amazing. I have one engineer who's still working with one of the strategic partners, and he started that program over a year ago. And so he's continuing on through just his dedication to, watching this thing through. And, when it comes to an engineering design, I think that's sort of like, a must for them. If they're stamping their name on a design or helping with, implementing some kind of new system, they need to make sure it's up and running and sustainable for the long term there. So to look at our approach, and this is not just our approach for the Farmer to Farmer program, but Engineering Service Corps in general, any of our projects are pretty much set up like this. So the one in Kosovo included a long-term project manager. So from the beginning of the project, we typically had at least one or two project managers that were there on I would say anywhere from a 2 to 4 month basis. I actually started with EWB as a volunteer. I was the first project manager in Kosovo as a volunteer there, and luckily got a job out of it. I guess that worked out. So, and piece of that was also we then had a technical engineer. So let's say the project manager would go scope 4 or 5 projects. We would identify a specific need for an engineering skill, and then we would have to come back and recruit for that. So, again, doing all this in a year-long time frame was sort of fast and furious, but it was amazing when we did reach out to find specific people to design a bio-waste digester for chicken manure. I found one. I found a guy who specializes in this. So to me, it was pretty amazing how we were able to pair that project manager up with these technical engineers who had a specialty, who then would come in for a 2 or 3 week period alongside that to then work on the specific project along with the project manager. Especially with an engineering project, you need at least a set of 2 people on it. not just to have that specific skill set, but also have that coordination, to have that follow through, but also that support mechanism. Engineers like to work in teams. But that also then, like I showed earlier with that figure, we had remote support. So perhaps we had a mechanical engineer working on a table grade project, and he needed to know something about the agriculture piece of it. So we would find then somebody who had a little bit more familiarity with the agriculture side through our network, and then he or she would help support them remotely. And then again, coming back to local engineers as well, EWB, one of our core components of our organization is we don't undermine the local capacity. If there's local engineers there, if there's local technicians there, we partner with them. And that's one of the sticking points to our organization, in terms of the fact that we would rather seek out even young university students and see if they would want to be part of our program as well. So I think along the whole entire year-long program, at various times we had professional engineers that were close of ours. We had university students who partnered with us who would go on field assignments, and we opened that up to anybody. And that was one of the big knowledge sharing pieces that we built into our program, that was sort of, not part of the general grant, but it's part of our mission, in terms of the fact that we would work with the local engineers. And one of our programs that I'm really proud of is we partnered with the University of Pristina, which really doesn't have a full-scale engineering program at the university. And we worked with them on at the dairy processors. They have this PLC equipment, it's process logic control. So it's like a little control box that controls all the pasteurizers and the temperatures and humidity and it brings all the systems together. It's like a little control box. And to someone like myself who's not an engineer, you would just think it's a pretty simple little plug and play thing. But the design work and the implementation of that is pretty sophisticated. And all the processors, the dairy processors, the herb processors, the chili processors that we visited, all needed equipment like this, or perhaps had old second-hand equipment that they had installed, but they didn't know how to run it. They didn't know how to maintain it. So that they had to get maintenance. Let's say their system broke down and they had to get maintenance. They would have to wait for a week or 2 weeks from somebody from Serbia or Greece to come up, and then they would have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to fix this equipment. So we actually partnered with the University of Pristina and a local engineering firm, and we did a very intensive, I think it was about a 3-week workshop with 4 hand-picked university students from the University of Pristina that actually Dean of the University picked. And we did a training program on PLC design and PLC maintenance. And one of the things I'm really proud of, 3 of those 4 students got hired by this engineering firm for a job. So, that was something to really, show that our knowledge sharing efforts went in. And the person who actually did that training was a university professor at Oklahoma State.
When you work with local engineer partners, are there costs involved?
No.
They're volunteers too.
Yeah. Well, and so in Kosovo specifically, there's not enough engineers, but the engineers that do work there actually don't have enough work because nobody really knows about engineering there as well. So it wasn't hard to pick up the phone and call a brother of a friend of somebody at the office. The next thing you know, you got a mechanical engineer sitting in the room with you because he wants to learn. He just wants to absorb that knowledge of the EWB members that came into the program. So, and we were also supported, like I said earlier, with Agro. Their program is set up to have a value chain approach. They're business people, they're agronomists. They work with the anywhere from the smallholder farmer to these agro businesses to help them move up the economic ladder of business. And so they were really engaged with us as well. They didn't know how to exactly tell us where to go and who to visit, but they had a lot of interest. Perhaps they heard from an apple farmer that they don't know how to store their apples right, or they're using a old, outdated technology of a lot of them use like what you would see bananas stored in. And I guess that's the worst thing to put an apple in because of the wax coating in it. I'm not sure exactly why, but we found an apple expert from upstate Michigan who knew all about apple storage. So we sent him over there, and he basically, it was very simple, helping them design crates for their storage, which helped their apples go from a 2-month storage to like a 4-month storage period. And those are the things, especially when you are in a local economy like that, and looking to be part of a bigger European economy, where if you can find ways to store and sell your produce in the off season, that's going to bring a lot of economic value. You talk about impact, and this is sort of a funny story within EWB, is we always talk about that table grape grower. How do we really, outside of our USAID program, how do we really tell the story of what we did with this table grape grower? And I always bring up the example of the fact that, like, before our program existed there, people were eating table grapes, very nutritional fruit on a local market. But now people in Western Europe are able to access these table grapes from Kosovo. And that creates a big economic opportunity for the people of Kosovo in terms of the fact that they're able to export their products now based off of the fact that they found better post-harvest storage solutions. And then coming back to then how our strategic partners and how we continue to support them. Our program had some long scoping pieces to it. That table grape example I used from the beginning, that was our first project we started in July of 2016. They were actually our last project as well. Working on another grant or another assignment with them. We did, I was telling you earlier, pre-cooling, which is a very sophisticated HVAC system that was designed and that they were able to purchase, to that transportation study. To the last piece of it is we actually designed a farm level charcoal cooler that uses some basic charcoal and wood, and it basically, it's very minimal the amount of temperature it saves, but even at that, like 1 or 2 degrees, makes a significant difference in the post-harvest storage of a table grape. And then coming back through just the end of it is the follow-through of EWB. Like I said earlier, we have several volunteers who have continued on with working with the strategic partners throughout their last year, and I see a lot of them continuing to follow up with them. And now there's just a couple pictures of our program. And like I said earlier, typically our program manager would be the person to identify and write these scopes of work that got approved. We would either have a technical volunteer there already, or we had identified a wide variety of them that we would know that would be ready to go on an instance. And if you want to just scroll through a couple of these, I'll just mention. So the one on the middle top is from our table grape, similar to the bottom. We worked with, on the left, Fruitomania, which is an amazing natural or an organic fruit juice producer in Kosovo. We helped them with basically fixing and figuring out their pasteurizer system. So then they could store their juice for a longer period of time. And then they went actually while we were there to a European trade show. And next thing you know, they got a huge order to ship their juice into Western Europe just because of that pasteurization system that they were able to install. And so these are some pictures of our staff working with local engineers, like I mentioned. That picture in the middle is Russ Zick on the left, who was one of our first long-term volunteers, working with a local engineer there to just talk about zeolite. Zeolite is this natural rock that can actually absorb energy when needed, and then at certain times release it. So this machine in the background was a way for this zeolite to use solar to collect the heat, absorb it during the daytime, and then in the evening hours, use that heat to make a drying system for herbs. Amazing stuff. I don't know the technical side of it at all, but it just looks cool when you saw the process working. And this just shows how they work hand in hand when they would go to some of the strategic partners, and that cross-sharing of knowledge, especially when it comes to bringing a local context to somebody who may have a better engineering skill set like Russ. That collaboration was really cool to watch. And this is that training program I mentioned with the University of Pristina students. I was pretty amazed at how hands-on this program was, and how basically these students took, their general mechanical engineering skills and were so interested in this. And so in Kosovo, one of the biggest issues is that I think they have the highest unemployment in Europe. So it's like a 68% unemployment rate, especially for the young kids, and their population is growing. So they have a lot of young students and young professionals who leave the country and never come back. So this was part of the program through the University of Pristina, is to help these younger students find jobs and find skill sets that will create jobs. And as I said, I was really proud that 3 of these students did continue on and get jobs, through this program. And just some of the other projects we worked on. We worked on a dairy water project that was another, I would say, 8 or 9 month project, which included 3 different assignments. under that, and it included, I think, 5 total volunteers where we went and scoped all the different smallholder dairy farms to figure out what their water and sanitation problems are, and then help them through a training mechanism and a hands-on intensive workshop to help them figure out, basic water and sanitation mechanisms to create better hygiene on their farm. And then that would increase the quality of their milk, which then they would get a better price for on the market. So challenges. We did have some challenges. I'm sure every farmer-to-farmer program has some challenges. Sometimes they were frustrating, but I think a lot of times we were able to work through it. I think, first and foremost, when we went in and worked with agro, I don't think they expected us to come in with the flurry that we did. And I think finding out the fact that when we got there, we didn't have all these programs set up, and we had to go in and basically identify, write scopes of work, get them approved, recruit volunteers, send them halfway across the world, and get this done in a year-long program was a challenge. I rose to that challenge as the project manager, and I was really excited to see the fact that we were able to identify some unique skill sets within our network. And I think that was one of the big takeaways, is that we do have a pretty darn amazing network of people who have specialties that I wouldn't even have imagined before getting into this really concentrated effort of looking for specific people. Kosovo is an interesting country. I would love to go back on some personal time and travel, and it's very similar to Colorado, where I live, where there's gorgeous mountains and natural beauty. But they've been, I think, a little bit spoiled in terms of the donor giveaway model. I think first and foremost, anytime we would go on a scoping mission, the first thing that they looked at us for was a big check to buy a piece of equipment. So we had to actually, when we would go on a scoping mission, have to change our approach a little bit in terms of even introducing ourselves and how we would introduce ourselves. And we would have to be very specific, is that we don't have any money for equipment. I mean, we had to be that blunt up front. And that actually, I would say we lost a few projects because they turned away and they weren't even interested in working with us. But we had to be that direct because unfortunately we couldn't go buy a $17,000 piece of, farm equipment. And then also, taking into account the agriculture calendar, I had been working in the agriculture sector for about 10 or 11 years prior to this project as well. And I actually, I guess, overlooked this slightly as well in terms of I'm used to working in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, where the growing seasons are extended. There's multiple growing seasons. Kosovo is very similar to the growing regions, I would say, of like northern Michigan. There's a winter period, there's a down period, there's also a big, holiday period in Kosovo. So in terms of trying to implement a grant within a year and get all these milestones met, you have a 2 or 3 month period where there's not a lot going on there. So we had to adjust to that very quickly, especially because our program started in July. We started scoping projects, all of a sudden it got to fall real quick. So, we had to take that into account as we adjusted, and maybe instead of having a smooth level of volunteers throughout the whole year, we had to sort of front end them and back end them in terms of the number of people we had. And then, lastly, I think one of the challenges is ensuring the long-term sustainability of these projects. As I mentioned before, we have a few volunteers who have continued on with them. I've opened up our efforts to Mark Wood to continue on with any of them that reached out to him, but the fact that now we're not in country, especially knowing EWD's model of being involved in communities for a long period of time, I'm a little bit nervous in terms of that those conversations are not happening between the agro office and the producers that we worked with, because there was a major language barrier. Albanian is not a really easy language to learn. I could say hello and goodbye by the time I left there, so that's why we had to really rely on the local coordinator who was our translator, who now is not part of our program, but I still try to communicate with them even on a monthly basis just to see, is there any opportunities for us to continue on with remote support. So I think, as we continue on looking to support these strategic partners, I just have to push a little harder to keep our name out there in terms of the fact that our volunteers are engaged long term and we're able to continue on with the support that we started with when we were in Kosovo.
How much funding or support did you get from the agro project? They gave you office space? Did they? Office space,
use of their cars, which was the biggest resource they could ever imagine. So they have, a fleet of 4 or 5 different cars. So we got access to their drivers. And because public transportation does not exist very well to go to these areas, and you can get across Kosovo within, it's a 3-hour radius to get to any border you want. So, we could spend one day like out in the field and come back to the city. So that I think having them as sort of a partner and being so ingrained into their program was a huge value, and mostly it was just the transportation, and also Mark Wood, who's the country director there, the chief of party, him championing this program through his staff members and letting us access and taking us to meetings and being involved from day one was a huge effort. If we didn't have somebody as engaged as him, would have definitely put us back a lot further in getting stuff done.
Did you have any of your activities that led to successes which that project is really bragging about now? I mean, that's fine if they did. I'm not suggesting.
I bet if you would call Mark up today, he wouldn't stop talking about this table grape project.
Yeah.
And there was a couple of similar ones. So soft fruits in general, table grapes, raspberries, blueberries. I couldn't believe how many were grown in this area. So Kosovo is one of the largest producers of raspberries in the world right now. You won't go anywhere outside of Kosovo to know that there was a berry grown in Kosovo, because the way that they don't have, they're not Global Gap certified yet. That was part of the program that we started as well with them, but we weren't able to finish. Is right now they sell all their raspberries to Serbia. Serbia slaps their sticker on it. This is grown in Serbia. So coming back to it, yes, I would bet the table grape one, very similar to now that they're able to look at this as an export market for these grapes. I think it's something like the whole entire program at Agro would brag about.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to have to slip.
All right. Yeah, it was great seeing you, Gary.
Thanks for coming,
Yeah.
Gary. Did you have more slides?
No,
Okay,
and that was a little longer than I expected, so I'll let you go ahead and jump in with your questions, Laura.
Terrific. I think I'll lead us off with one, but then I'll open it up for others as well. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the remote volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you were able to well exceed the numbers that were initially planned for the project, and I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about how you organized that, both from a logistical perspective and a technical perspective. How did it work?
Sure. So from the logistical perspective, I think, this is a general way of looking how it was so successful is when we did identify a program that needed a specific skill set, we would go into our network and recruit. And perhaps we identified 2 or 3 people that had the skill set we needed, but only one of them was available to travel at the time. Because again, like I said earlier, our project came up fast and we had to have people that were available quickly. There was times where we were booking tickets 2 weeks out to get people overseas, which was not a lot of time to have them settle their lives and pick up and go for 2 or 3 weeks. So through that process, again, was sort of that team approach in terms of, we identified folks who were really interested in the program, who wanted to provide some service. So perhaps they did research while the other engineer was, packing his bags and getting ready to head overseas. Or perhaps they did have a little different skill set in terms of what they were able to provide. We did one project with chicken manure, and it was using the again, I'm not a technical guy, so I apologize if I use the wrong terms, but a biodigestion process to make this into some kind of heat system to dry herbs and use it as a sort of a byproduct. And we had a guy who was very familiar with waste use in that technology, but we were also looking for somebody who understood how to use manure for that as well in general. So we had a team there of a gentleman here in the U.S. who supported. I think they had probably Skype calls and email exchanges almost every day while he was in country. So the remote volunteers as well, they weren't just somebody who they would rely on before or after, but there were several cases where these remote volunteers would be on, evening and weekend calls with our in-country volunteers to help them just through the process of a team approach.
Okay, so really the remote volunteers were not in general working directly with host organizations. They were supporting the work of a volunteer that went in country.
Absolutely, yeah. They wouldn't. I don't think we had an instance where they would work directly with them. Perhaps
that was one of my questions. Yeah. How you work out the language barriers and technology barriers, things like that.
Yeah, and a lot of times too. So what would happen, and not just when our local coordinator was available, but on the outside as well, we would always have to. I would say 9 times out of 10 work with either the local coordinator or our value chain manager colleague there because of the language barrier.
Okay.
Some of the more sophisticated agribusinesses that were maybe in the green belt around Pristina spoke English enough for us, but never in a way we would never actually talk about technical stuff. If we could have a conversation with somebody in English, just on general things, that would be okay. But especially in engineering, you don't want to take any very technical type terminology and then present it to somebody who may not have that as their first language, because that's a lot of times things get lost in translation when you do it that way. So any type of technical documents or technical information that was needed was always done through a translator.
Great. So let me check in with people who've called in. Are there any questions from the phone?
This is Jen. What was the dollar amount of your award? And it was a one-year project, right?
Yep, excuse me. Yes, it was around $150,000.
Okay.
And actually, for a small grant program, that's the size of most of our small grants, and you were able to send more volunteers and leverage more funds than average. Mm-hmm. Do you have any comments about how you were able to do that?
I think part of it was just supply chain in terms of what we were able to get for prices on airfare. The housing we had was not as high as we expected, so we were able to buy more plane tickets in that terms of it. So I think we were very creative in terms of using that money to the best of having the most volunteer days in country. And then we also were able to leverage the transportation part of that through AGRA was huge. At some point of it, I think this may have been before I took over the program too, they discussed hiring and having a dedicated driver for herself. I mean, that would have been, another $7 to $10 grand right there that we would have had to spend, but that money was able to be used to send more volunteers overseas.
Any other questions from the phone? Let me open up to the room.
Yeah, I had a question. Thanks.
Sure.
It was a really great presentation and the impact. I mean, it's amazing, when you start out to do X, Y, and Z, and then it trickles out almost all the other things that were accomplished. The one thing I was curious, because it's a little bit, the partnership with AGRA, Tetra Tech, and how did that come about? Because that's not always the usual model of, kind of coming out with an existing program and using the resources. It sounds like it was a good connect. Did you approach them, or did someone put you in touch with each other? And are you planning that? It sounds like a good model, so just kind of curious how that came about.
Well, I'll start with the end before I go to the beginning. I think if you as VEGA or farmer to farmer in general can find more ways to leverage in-country partners like that, that was the one thing I think, that was our shining star in terms of if we wouldn't have that support, it would have been very difficult to do a one-year grant in a country that we're not familiar with.
Right.
Mark Wood found us through Tetra Tech. He reached out to his colleagues in Tetra Tech, and EWB is actually a corporate partner relationship with Tetra Tech's for-profit arm. They're U.S.-based engineering firm. So I think through the connections, Mark heard about EWB. He reached out to his network. Next thing you know, we had a project together.
Great. And are you in? I guess Tetra Tech. Then you have that relationship, and that's great. Mm-hmm. Excellent.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the different model that you use in terms of technical engineering solutions versus persons trained, because I feel like on the farmer to farmer programs, a lot of them focus on training, and that's a key indicator for farmer to farmer. And one of the things that I think we struggled with early on was really understanding that this project was not going to train a lot of people.
No.
It wasn't going to be that kind of numbers, but that you were actually providing engineering solutions. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that model and how you think it might be applied more broadly to the farmer to farmer community and to other projects.
Sure. So as I said earlier, we did have a couple that were more training intensive, the dairy wash program, this PLC one. Those were more of your typical training programs in terms of we were working with a group of individuals on, transferring knowledge to them on how to, be better at their services. But that was a small piece of it. The majority of our assignments were working hand in hand, providing designs, working with maybe just one or two. Let's say there's a dairy processor that has 15 employees. We go there, we do an assessment, we meet all 15 of them, we watch their process, but we're only working with their either owner or maintenance person, if they had one, on, understanding more of their challenges and what then they needed from a technical review and a technical design. So that would be the people we would assist in them. And, that would also include, like I said earlier, local engineers that would come in. That was sort of a secondary piece of it. So it may not be as prominent in our reporting that we worked with these local engineers. But that was always, if we could, always have that as piece of it, as well as the fact that I guess that would be typically of a training program as well. But it wasn't our core piece of our deliverable with these designs. So typically it would be then working with the people on site there, and then also with the supply chain as well. Some of the times we would work with local technicians or local equipment suppliers to help them do specs, help them identify the equipment that would need to be purchased. A lot of it, I would say at least half of our end deliverables are sort of still hypothetical in terms of we presented designs that included a bill of materials that included a pretty big price tag. Then it was from there that these agribusinesses would have to take it that next step. They would have to apply for grants. They would have to look for loans. They would have to raise money to buy this equipment. And that whole mechanism was piece of it as well that Mark Wood at Agro put in there as well. He knew this from the beginning. Agro's investment is typically, working through their value chain managers to figure out ways to invest in these agribusinesses. So perhaps Mark had money to go buy that $10,000 piece of equipment for the farmer, or maybe he had a connection at the Ministry of Agriculture in Kosovo that had a grant mechanism as well. So he was using our designs and our deliverables to help these agribusinesses be set up to write the opportunities to get funding.
And you said about half of them have already been able to either self-fund or get funding, and about half of them are still there?
I don't know that specifically. I mean, that's one of the takeaways that I have is if I could, I'd go back there for a week and follow up with all these guys specifically, because it's hard to do that remotely. But I'm hoping, even over the next, 3 or 4 months now that their agriculture season is coming to a slow point, that I can, talk to Mark a little bit about, what that follow-up was now that it's, 3 or 4 months since we've left the country.
Great. Do we have other questions?
I have a few.
Sure, go for it. I love it.
So the engineering solutions that you identified, what percentage were off-the-shelf solutions versus new design, new build?
0 were off the shelf.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of, this isn't like a plug and play type scenario at any of these. So that's why, again, these technical engineers, I think, really were needed in terms of perhaps there were some best practices that needed to be, implemented that, for example, one of the dairy processors, they had a PLC system that they bought secondhand from Greece 10 years ago. I don't even know what it was used for before, but it was trying to connect all their pasteurizers and dairy equipment, that perhaps was sort of duct taped. I use that analogy of the fact that it was sort of a duct taped system in their processing. So we actually went in there and redesigned that whole entire system using more up-to-date technology, and basically retrofitting their whole entire PLC system to be very customized. And actually that example was another success story I forgot to mention, is that this processor saw such a value in what was designed that they actually self-funded themselves to purchase this equipment. So our first program was to design this PLC system. Through the winter period, they raised the money, they bought it. Our second scope of work with this dairy processor was actually to take that physical piece of equipment, install it with them, and do a training with their maintenance folks on how to use that equipment. So that's one success story that's been all the way through to implementation.
Okay. So the actual deliverable from the engineer, in some cases it's the final product, but in other cases it may be a design?
Yeah, I would say most of the time it was actually just a design or a better process for the implementers. But also, like I said, there were a couple cases that were unique in terms of the dairy water one that I mentioned earlier. That was the end deliverable to that was an intensive workshop by water experts on how to do basic things like clean your milking machine, how to separate your wastewater from your clean water when it comes to the cleaning of it, because E. coli and other bacteria can really grow on the milking equipment. And it was really actually simple stuff. One of them was at several of these dairy farmers, they were really hygienic in terms of cleaning their equipment, but they did it right after a milking. And so within that next 5 or 6 hours before that next milking, there's so many airborne bacteria and stuff in the air that would collect on the milking equipment. So our basic process was clean it after and right before. And that was very simple, but that was something that could increase the quality or make their milk significantly.
Okay, got it. Then my last question, you mentioned that you scoped out 65 projects.
Yeah.
How did you initially identify those 65?
And I'm cringing a little bit because I probably scoped out myself almost 30 of those projects. I mean, it was, well, I can't tell you how many miles or kilometers I got riding through the countryside of Kosovo. It was a challenge. We basically, at the beginning, would go anywhere they would send us. I would say that was a fault of ours to not vet them a little closer before we just jumped in the Jeep and went out to the field. I mean, we saw everything from a $20 million hydro dam they wanted us to design to, other projects that just did not make sense. So I think we got smarter as we, got into the field a little bit, because we went in there with big eyes, excited to do anything and to, take on any challenge. But I think we had to do a little bit more closer vetting before, on the office side of even just setting up a call with the processors, understanding what that long-term value was, understanding what the relationship was with agro. So again, I think that was a learning process early on where, perhaps if we were in country, maybe even a month beforehand with just a project manager, knowing that we had that extra window to identify these the programs and these projects would have helped us along the way to really move forward a little quicker.
Okay, so it was agro that was suggesting.
Yeah, so what I think agro did, and it's no fault of theirs, is Mark had probably a meeting with all of his value chain managers. He said, we have this team from Engineers Without Borders who's going to be here for a year-long project. Think through all your businesses that you work with, and if you have identified any engineering challenges with them, let me know. And I think probably they all handed him a list, and that was as far as the research went into it, where we thought we were coming into a more vetted process, where then we were handed this list of 100 different projects to go vet, thinking everyone had an engineering project, but a lot of times it hadn't even been asked to the actual project people, the businesses, on what they needed. So that first vetting process, I think, was not as well done as we thought it would be. So.
Okay. Great.
But I think that added to the fun and the challenge of it as well. We needed, especially with our first project manager, myself, and my two technical staff that came in. We brought two, and that I think actually was a good thing that I can't take credit for. But the way that the program was set up was I went there as sort of the program manager with the lens of not being an engineer. So I'm good with building relationships. I'm good at the agriculture side. We did bring then two, I would call them medium-term volunteers that came in that had more general engineering skills that could take on a variety of projects. So as we filled that pipeline in the beginning, we actually took on projects that were more like semi-technical than very specific, because then those guys could start working on projects. Well, then we had some time to really recruit the really specific engineers that had a skill set that were really unique to, certain projects.
Do we have any final questions for Anjali?
One.
Sure.
So kind of to bounce off of that, what was the criteria for deciding whether or not to take on a scope of work?
I think, in general, like I said, we went in there with really big eyes and we started looking at a lot of these, but a lot of it was, are they doable? Is it something that's in our skill set, in our recruitment level? And there were some that, I don't know, we only actually, I think, had one, maybe two scopes throughout our whole program that we got approved that we didn't finish. So we vetted that process very closely from the beginning. We actually wouldn't even send a scope of work in for approval until, I would say, 9 times out of 10, we had already identified a volunteer. And that's just how EWB works. We don't want to, especially working in a culture, that's new to engineering, we didn't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So a lot of times we would work hand in hand with the agro business and the value chain managers at agro to identify this, and at the same time start that recruiting process right away. So then when it did come to the point where we would have a final scope of work developed, that we would already have those steps in place to at least have a head engineer identified. And that way I feel like we didn't just leave people hanging to promise them that we were going to come in and finish this project and not be able to do it.
I have one more question. You've mentioned in passing that engineers like to work in teams. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, was the only model for that the remote support and then the engineer in country, or were there different ways you were using them in teams?
I would say every assignment that we did was structured a little differently. As I said before, we had a program manager that was there, project manager, program manager that was there for long term. That person was also an engineer. Perhaps they were a junior engineer or a general engineer, but they would have that discipline of being a second set of eyes. So there were projects that included a project manager who was maybe an electrical engineer and a technical engineer on the side as well, and then they would leverage remote support if needed. So, a lot of times in country there were several engineers on a program, but there were some occasions where there would be so many projects going on. Our latter part of our program, towards this past May and April timeframe, I think there was one time we had maybe, for us this was a lot, I would say 8 volunteers in country. So one project manager trying to organize and get all those people out into the field was a little bit difficult at times. So there were occasions where there would be a specific volunteer, and I would always vet that closely with the volunteer to know that I could count on them to go be independent in country. That then we would have technical volunteers there that would be on their own getting a project done.
Do we have any more questions? We're coming up towards the end of our time, but we probably have time for maybe one more.
Kevin, this is Jen. I'll follow up with you separately. I know, you and I had previous conversations, and it might be a good time for us to chat a little bit more, just sort of about other things. So I'll send you an email.
Great, thanks, Jen.
Yeah, great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for calling in, Jen, and thanks everyone for attending. I think this has been great. We have a recording of the session, and we'll do a one-page summary that we'll post on farmertofarmer.org. If anyone has any final questions for Kevin, I can certainly share your contact information.
Absolutely, yeah. Feel free. I love to share the story, and again, the successes we had, but also I'm open to providing feedback on the challenges as well, which some of it is from just in general how the project happened, but I don't think anything caused us any delays or big issues, but some things that we learned as well in terms of how to implement a project like this.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for coming in and for your time, and everyone have a great day.